Welcome to the Ranchonomics Podcast, where we empower you to build a better ranch and transform your operations into a thriving business. I'm your host, John Haskell. Let's get started. All right. Good morning and welcome to the Ranchonomics Podcast. I am joined today by Wally Olson and Jared Luhman, and we are going to have an exciting discussion today. Jared, welcome to the Ranchonomics Podcast.
Thanks, guys. Thanks so much for having me.
You bet. And Wally, welcome back.
Yeah.
Wally and I did a podcast about intrinsic value with Jared on the Herd Quitter podcast, and we are going to get into a question that Jared and some of his listeners had after that episode. Before we get into that, I want to have Jared introduce himself and his podcast, which has recently undergone a rebranding. So, Jared, give us a little background and a little about your podcast.
Yeah, you bet. Yeah, so if folks like listening to this one, they'll probably like listening to mine because it's had you on multiple times and you guys are great guests on it. But it's, yes, the Ranching Returns podcast. We're talking to farmers and ranchers all around the country who are doing some kind of innovative ranch practices and have found pretty good lifestyle, pretty good land management, and profitable businesses through that. So release an episode every Monday. Check it out wherever you listen at Ranching Returns Podcast. And then also, I guess, myself, I'm a farmer in Southeast Minnesota raising cow-calf pairs and seed stock for Faro Cattle Company.
Love it. Very good. We enjoy visiting over there, and we always have a good time, and we always get a lot of good questions from that. So this is one I wanted to follow up. We've talked a number of times on this podcast and on others about yours and working cows and others, about the concept of intrinsic value. And I want to expand on this a little bit because I thought the question you brought back to us was really a good one. So why don't you go ahead? I'll have you ask that question, and then we'll set Wally loose to tear it up. So let's see how we do.
Yeah, so the question, it came to my mind after the fact. I find that often when I'm interviewing and re-editing, I'm like, man, I should have asked this question, and it didn't come to my mind in the middle of the conversation. But the question is essentially, when you did this intrinsic value of a cow, you were comparing it to trading her for essentially an open calf and taking her to a bred heifer. In that example or that scenario, you assumed in 1 year that the bred heifer would be bred, but you assumed that 3 or 4 year old cow would be open. And I figured that should impact those numbers pretty significantly if that cow came up open as a 4-year-old as opposed to bred. And I was just kind of curious why you run that cow as assuming she'll come up open and the heifer calf comes bred.
So are you ready, Mr. Luhman?
I am.
Okay, here we go. And the example I'm going to work through today, and these slides that I'm working off of, I think will be connected to this podcast.
Yes, we'll create a link.
So what we're working off of here is there was a gentleman that had some fall calving pairs, and he was debating about whether he should keep them or sell them, keep them till later or sell them now. And in making decision, there's more than just the numbers. This gentleman is basically a spring calving person, and he's got these odd fall pairs around. And do they create extra work? And just, there's many other questions than just price, but price and value is one. And these pairs that he had, there was some pairs that sold at the local sale barn, and they brought $3,200 to $3,600. So there is a starting place. So we worked through the intrinsic value of this cow. If she weighed 1,200 pounds and she's worth at $1.15, she's worth $1,380. The 500-pound calf at 3 1/4 is worth $1,625. So that's $3,005. And when I'm working through intrinsic value, I put a 5% disappearance on the income. Cows die, calves die, just stuff happens. And you take the $3,005 and multiply it by 0.95, you come up with $2,854. And he's thinking about carrying this cow to April or 5 months away at the time we did this. So that's at $2 a day or $60 a month is $300. So her intrinsic value is $2,554. And so if you compare that to what they sold for, those cows are way overvalued. But you've got to understand that in your inventory value, cows have different values, and you need to come up with value to me. And so this is, I think, we'll start answering your questions, Jared. if she was a 3-year-old cow or 4-year-old cow, before she started to depreciate, she would probably be worth, $2,700 as a bred cow coming this spring. And so you take the 2,700, add in the calf value, the 1,625, you come up with 4,325. You take that times 0.95, it's $4,108 of value. Subtract the $300 of cost to carry, and so now this pair is worth $3,808. So in theory, if she's a 3-year-old cow, she may not be overvalued at the $3,400. Now, does that help you out on your question?
So essentially, in this scenario, you're saying that that first one that you assumed is open, you're kind of considering in that depreciation, or she's later in life and that she'll start to lose value a lot more rapidly. And in the second example, you're assuming when she's younger that she maintains her value then?
What I'm assuming here, the first example is just the bare bones value of her. There's no other value to her. I mean, this is just harvest the cow and the calf. This is her value, and we'll get into show some examples a little later. And then the value to me is you got to understand what you have. And like I said, if you have a 3-year-old cow, a 3-year-old cow is a whole lot different than a 7-year-old cow. And you just need to be honest with yourself on valuation and go forward.
Yeah. And then the other question I had on that, you're talking about overvalued or undervalued. This intrinsic value of a cow, you're comparing that to what she would be worth today as a bred female, is to decide whether or not to keep her for another year or to sell her today.
That is correct.
So we see examples where the intrinsic value, for example, now might come out to be somewhere in the low 2,000. So let's say it's $2,200, and the price is $2,700 to $3,000. Well, that would make her appear to be overvalued. And then we see the opposite case where sometimes that intrinsic value is in that same range and you can buy one for $1,700. Well, maybe then that cow is undervalued. But I do think there are some places where we want to make sure we understand what intrinsic value means. And so, Wally, why don't you explain that a little bit? Because I think the intrinsic value combined with the value to you is pretty important because that can cover a pretty good range and we have to understand what decision we're making there.
And the intrinsic value is just the value that you can harvest her at basically any day. And what you use there is just what the Kohl cow price is, the calf price today, both of these today. And then you add those two numbers together and I multiply it by 0.95, and that comes up to be her bare bones value.
And so that is the value of her in the future today, right?
Yep, is how I look at it. And then there's value to you, what she is. Like I said, 3-year-old cow, first calf, heifer, 3-year-old, 4-year-old, 5-year-old, depending on the market, they hold their value pretty well. And then they start tailing off. There's sometimes that they hold their value out to 6. So you got to do the relationships. Everything is relationships. It has nothing to do with timing, age, or anything. It's just the relationships of the market. And then those cows start tailing off in value or depreciate.
Struggling to break into the tight-knit world of ranching? Connect, compete, and grow with our new networking platform. Real ranchers, real insights, real opportunities. Visit ranching.fyi and click forums.
Well, let me just move forward a little bit. Right now, we're going to do the cow bell curve. And this is one of my only original thoughts in my life. And the reason I came up with it is to find out the relationships. And that's all we're doing here is finding out the relationships of a heifer calf to a bred cow to a Kohl cow. And I use 550 pounds and 1,100 pound Kohl cow, but you can change all of that. And in this case that we were talking about, on that same day, a 500-pound high-quality heifer calf brought $2.92, so she's worth $1,460. And the bred cow, if you average them, was $3,400. And the Kohl cow at 1,200 pounds was at $1.15, was $1,380. And one thing I want to point out to everybody is that if you look at that 1460 and the 1380, the price of the heifer calf and the value of the Kohl cow is about equal. You understand what I'm saying? And this is one of the reasons I truly believe the cow-calf business is basically break-even, because we do not capture the appreciation that goes on in our inventory value from up to the bred cow. And in this case, you can sell that bred cow for $3,400, buy a heifer calf or keep a heifer calf, and you have $1,940 of value there of cash to make that heifer calf into a bred heifer or whatever you want to do. And then on the side of that, going from $3,400 down to $1,380 is $2,020. So that is a significant amount of depreciation going on there. And you have got to capture the appreciation of the inventory value. I'm about going to quit talking about depreciation because nobody talks about appreciation. And that is the key in this business, to understand the relationships, and they're always changing, but that is where you can really make the cow-calf business very profitable. I went down and I spent weekends with Bud Williams, and I was a stocker person, and I wasn't too excited about cows. And every weekend he had an agenda, and one was how to make money with cows. And let me tell you, it changed my life, and I want to thank him for that. So, is there any questions right now to this point, Jared?
So the one thing you talked about that I guess I hadn't maybe pulled out of the last conversation we had that was interesting to me is the idea of, you talked about the undervalued versus overvalued by essentially that intrinsic cow is determining its value in a year, or its value today based on accounting for the next year's incomes and expenses, and determining whether or not she's overvalued or undervalued by saying, is her value today accounting for the next year's income and expenses greater than or less than her value today just to sell? That was interesting to me. And then the other thing that we kind of talked about in the last week's conversation is that's one comparison you can do, is say, is she worth more to me in a year than today? And then the other thing that you could do is say, is she worth more than a heifer calf? Is she undervalued or overvalued in comparison to another class of animal altogether? That was kind of interesting. You could run kind of two conversations there. You could be profitable keeping a cow, but less profitable than doing something different. And neither are wrong.
One thing you have to realize, like on this cow bell curve thing, there's another thing that, and this depends on your age of your cows. If you have, like I said, the 3-year-old cow, she has time on her side. The 5-year-old cow or 6-year-old cow, she is starting to run out of time before she really starts to depreciate. And so you can do this trade and you pick up, in this case, the $1,940, plus you're picking up time, which to me is a big factor in this. Going back to 2014, I had a gentleman I was visiting with, and he was just agonizing over how stupid he was that he kept some heifer calves in 2014. And I tried to explain to him that that was not a bad thing to do. Where he erred was, at that time, he could have probably sold some of those cows for $3,500 or $4,000. And where he erred was keeping those cows because they just ran out of time about the same time that the market broke. And, those $3,500 and $4,000 cows now all of a sudden turned into $950 Kohl cows. And that's, to me, where he really erred. The heifer calf, you could just keep on keeping on.
That's interesting. I hadn't considered that. And that was part of one of the things I wanted to bring you on is are there different classes of livestock to hold in a potentially downward trending market? And that might not be where we want to go with this with only a few minutes left of that. But you're kind of talking about, you can maintain an inventory value with heifers and have less downward risk potentially maybe by keeping those heifer calves than a cow that was.
What you do is you have building up cash. And if it's all right with you, we will just do a podcast with you on downward trending markets. How's that?
Because it's a real topic.
It's a real big topic. And one thing that I want to point out here is keep everything simple. You understand what I'm saying? All we're looking at in this cowbell curve is the relationships of the heifer calf to the bred cow to the cull cow. And it says that you can pick up $1,940 in cash and still maintain your inventory. And that's all you need to take away from this. This bred cow is probably overvalued. And so you just do the trade. And that's where you stop, because where a lot of people get into trouble is they will say, well, okay, those heifers won't breed. Some of them won't breed, and they won't do this and they won't do that. That does not matter. What matters is that heifer calf is undervalued to that cow. So you sell the cow, keep the heifer, and if you want to breed her, it's probably a very good deal. And if she comes up open, or you maybe decide not to breed her, it's still a very good deal to do. Sell by marketing is using simple math and just don't cloud up what you're trying to do. And another place that intrinsic value of the cow works out is this fall, young open cows were selling for $1,400. And so, okay, I wanted to work through and see if they had value. So if you bought a cow, bred her to calve in the fall, it would be April of 2026 before she'd have a calf ready to sell. And so you work through this, the 1,200-pound cow was worth $1.10, and so it's $13.20. The 500-pound calf in this case was $3. So that's $2,820 of value she'll generate, and take it times 0.95, that's $2,679. And you got to put 17 months of carry in her at $60. That is $1,020. And so it comes out that the intrinsic value of the cow is $1,659. So she is a good buy. And so we bought them. Now, at the rate bred cows are going right now, we will never calve them. But we know that she was undervalued to carry her out that far.
Yeah, and I think the weird thing in my mind that is neat is that you can make money without ever catching a calf. You can be in the cow business, never calve a cow, and make money more than you could maintaining a herd of cows that are calving and stuff.
That is very true. But boy, you talk about a paradigm shift. One of the big things that Bud drills into me is know and understand yourself. What are you willing to do? And rebreeding a cow, there's some people that, think that's the greatest sacrilege sin that you could ever do.
And those are not your customers when you have those types of cows to sell, are they?
Nope.
Love it. All right, Jared, does that get at the heart of your question?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, no, I appreciate that.
Well, I appreciate you being willing to share this with us, and I really appreciate you joining us today because I get a lot of questions after we talk. I'd like to kind of address those as we go. The nice thing about our relatively short format is I think we can take one question like that, go ahead and actually run it through. And it sometimes takes longer than a person thinks. But I do want to emphasize that you made a few points earlier that I think were really good observations. One, the intrinsic value is the value of that cow today. And we're talking about the future, right? When we're talking about a cow, we're talking about calf production in the future, feed costs that are in the future. We're trying to sort of create a comparison to, just as you said, what if we sold that cow today? The other thing is that value can be very different between different producers. So depending on your cost to keep, depending on your capabilities, your grass availability, all that sort of thing. And you can have situations where the intrinsic value, to my mind, gives you a very clear answer about which direction to go. And there are other times when maybe the answer is not so clear. And in those cases, I think, you have reasonable choices in different directions. I think if we simplify our life a little bit, think about each opportunity we have to sell or buy as kind of a fork in the road, then this is a way that we can help make those decisions. None of them are perfect. None of them predict the future. All of them deal with the relationships today, but it gives us some solid ground upon which to decide which fork in the road we want to choose on any particular day.
And everybody says, well, what happens out there, if she doesn't do this? It doesn't matter. Whatever you do, you're keeping the most undervalued animal in your herd today, and you go forward. Don't worry about what's going to happen in the future. When you get to the future, we'll
worry about that then.
Well, no, we won't even worry about it. We will just do the math and react accordingly.
Perfect. That's very good. All right. Any other final thoughts? Let's get wrapped up. Jared, I'm really glad you were able to join us today. Thank you very much. And as always, Wally, it's great to have you on. Any final thoughts?
None here. No, thanks, guys.
Okay, sounds good. So please listen to Jared's podcast over at Ranching Returns, found on all the places you can find podcasts. Gentlemen, thank you very much. You have a wonderful day, and we will talk again soon. Thank you for tuning into the Ranchnomics podcast. We hope this episode helped you win today. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and share it with a friend.